Snow didn't care who it buried. It fell hard, merciless, swallowing the streets in a relentless white grip. Ellis, a homeless boy, crouched against a brick wall in a forsaken alley, his thin coat useless against the biting wind. His fingers were numb, his breath a frail cloud vanishing into the dark. He doubted he'd see dawn. Beside him sat a German shepherd, ragged and shivering, its amber eyes fixed on Ellis with a haunted gleam. The dog had lingered for weeks, a silent shadow, never too near, never fully gone. They were kindred, lost, forsaken souls in a world that turned away. The cold stabbed deep, 1,000 icy shards piercing his skin. His blanket, worn, tattered, was his only shield. He couldn't bear it anymore. With trembling hands, he pulled it off and draped it over the dog. A reckless act, maybe his last. The shepherd stiffened, unsure, then pressed closer. Its warmth was weak, but it flickered against the chill. Ellis's head spun. Hunger gnawed at him, fierce and hollow. Exhaustion dragged him down. Maybe he'd just sleep, let the snow take him. Then the dog's ears twitched. A low growl rumbled from its throat. Ellis jolted, eyes wide. Footsteps crunched in the snow, slow, deliberate. Someone was out there, watching. The dog barked, sharp and loud, splitting the silence. Ellis's heart pounded, a frantic thud. He squinted into the blizzard. A shadow stood under the streetlight, too distant for a face. Run? His legs were dead weight, useless. The shepherd bristled, stepping forward, guarding him. The steps halted. A voice, deep, rough, sliced through the wind. "Hey!" Ellis's chest tightened. Who was this? Savior or predator? The dog growled again, teeth flashing, poised to strike. The shadow crept closer. Ellis had given his blanket away, a desperate gamble. But had he just spared his life or sealed his doom? Snow piled higher, a suffocating veil drowning the alley in white. The wind shrieked, a savage howl rattling the skeletal remains of forgotten buildings. Ellis hugged the brick wall tighter, its rough surface scraping his back through his thin coat. His breath came fast, shallow, dissolving into the storm. The streetlight buzzed and flickered, its dim glow stuttering across the snow like a dying pulse. Shadows danced at the edges, sharp and jagged, stretching too long to be natural. Ellis's eyes darted, searching. Nothing or something. The cold gripped him harder, a living claw sinking into his chest, punishing his sacrifice. The German shepherd stayed close, its faint heat a fragile thread in the icy dark. Its growl thrummed low, a steady warning, eyes locked beyond the alley's mouth where the shadow had stood. Ellis's gut twisted, fear blooming cold and sharp. Whoever was out there hadn't left. They lingered, unseen, patient. The air thickened, heavy with a wrongness he couldn't name. Snow muted every sound, every creak, every rustle, but dread roared in his ears, deafening. His hands shook, fear outweighing the frostbite. What did they want? Him? The dog? The shepherd's ears flattened, its body taut, sensing what Ellis couldn't see. Something was closing in. He felt it, a crawling certainty prickling his skin. The light flickered again, plunging the alley into a heartbeat of black. Ellis's breath caught. Had a shape moved? Just beyond the snow's edge, tall and still? His mind reeled. The dog's growl spiked, fierce, urgent. Panic clawed up his spine, raw and wild. He wanted to run, but his legs were numb, rooted. The stranger's voice, "Hey!" echoed in his skull, too steady, too calm for this frozen nightmare. The night pressed closer, suffocating. Ellis's heart raced, a trapped bird in his ribs. Whatever watched them was near now, its presence a weight he couldn't shake. The dog bared its teeth, ready. Ellis wasn't alone. But that didn't mean he was safe. Not yet. Ellis wasn't always invisible, just another shadow the world forgot. At 16, he'd been on the streets for 2 years, ever since his mom's boyfriend decided fists were better than words and the shelter beds ran dry. He was small for his age, wiry, with dark hair matted from weeks without a wash. His hazel eyes carried too much grief for a family that didn't want him, fear of the nights that never ended. Hunger was his constant shadow, a gnawing ache he'd learned to ignore, but the cold? That was new, a beast he couldn't outrun. He'd survived worse. Men with greedy hands, cops who didn't care. But this winter was different. It wanted him dead. The blanket he'd given away wasn't just fabric. It was his last tether to hope, a scrap he'd clung to through dumpster dives and sleepless nights. Now, pressed against the alley wall, he felt its absence like a missing limb. His fingers flexed, stiff and useless, as regret gnawed at him. Why'd he do it? For a dog? The German shepherd beside him wasn't just some stray. Ellis had named him Ghost weeks ago, after the way he'd appeared, silent, sudden, like a phantom in the snow. Ghost's fur was patchy, his ribs stark under his skin, but those amber eyes held a fire Ellis envied. They'd never spoken, not really, yet Ghost stayed, watched, followed. When Ellis found half a burger in a trash can, Ghost got a bite. When Ellis slept, Ghost kept guard. It was trust, unspoken and raw, forged in shared desperation. But there was something else. Ghost's scars, old and jagged, hinted at a past Ellis couldn't guess. Where'd he come from? Why him? Ellis didn't know, and it ate at him, a quiet mystery under the fear. His chest heaved now, panic surging as the shadow lingered beyond the alley. He wasn't a fighter, too small, too tired, but Ghost's growl gave him something to hold on to. His mind raced. He'd seen kids like him vanish, frozen, beaten, or worse. Was this his turn? The stranger's voice replayed, calm and heavy. Hey! Ellis's jaw tightened. No one stopped for him. No one cared. So why now? Ghost shifted, ears back, ready to lunge. Ellis's breath hitched. The shadow moved again, closer, bolder. Was this kindness, or the start of something he couldn't escape? Snow swirled thicker, a relentless curtain that hid the world beyond the alley. Ellis's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. His body pressed against the icy brick as if it could swallow him whole. The shadow under the streetlight hadn't moved, but its presence gnawed at him. Too still, too quiet. Ghost's growl deepened, a guttural hum that vibrated through the frozen air. Ellis's mind spun. Was this real, person, or something else? Something the cold had conjured to finish him off? He'd heard stories, whispers from other street kids about shapes in the dark, things that weren't human. His fingers dug into the wall, scraping skin. He didn't believe that stuff, couldn't, but the fear was real, a weight crushing his chest. The stakes were simple, survival. Ellis had nothing left. No blanket, no strength, just Ghost and the fading warmth between them. If he stayed, the cold would win. If he ran, whatever waited out there might catch him. He squinted, eyes stinging from the wind. The shadow shifted, just a step, but enough to make his heart lurch. Ghost barked, loud and fierce, a warning that echoed off the buildings. The figure froze. "I'm not here to hurt you," came the voice again, rough but steady, cutting through the storm. A man, then, not a ghost. Not yet. Ellis's throat tightened. He didn't trust it. People lied. People hurt. But the cold was a liar too. It promised rest, then death. Ellis forced his legs to move, sliding along the wall, Ghost at his side. He had to know, had to see. The snow crunched under his worn sneakers, each step a battle against the ache in his bones. The man stayed put, hands raised, gloved fingers catching the flickering light. "You'll freeze out here," he said, softer now. Ellis stopped, 10 feet away, Ghost bristling beside him. The man's face was half hidden by a hood, but his eyes glinted, tired, sunken. "I saw you give him that blanket." Ellis's stomach twisted. Watching. He'd been watching. "Why?" Ellis rasped, voice cracking. The man hesitated. "Because I couldn't walk by." Ellis's mind raced. No one stopped. No one cared. So why this guy? He glanced at Ghost, whose ears twitched, tracking something Ellis couldn't hear. The man reached into his coat. Slow, deliberate. Ellis tensed, ready to bolt. Ghost growled, low and mean. But the man pulled out a protein bar, not a knife, and set it on the snow between them. Take it. No strings. Ellis stared, hunger roaring in his gut. It was a trap. Had to be. He'd learned that lesson, kindness always costs something. But his body betrayed him, trembling, weak. He inched forward, Ghost watching his every move. His fingers closed around the bar, cold and shaking. He ripped it open, took a bite. Dry. Bland. Life. Ghost whined, and Ellis broke off a piece, tossing it to him. The dog snatched it, eyes locked on the man. Good, the man muttered, stepping back. I've got a place. Warm. Safe. Ellis froze, the bar halfway to his mouth. Safe. That word was a lie. He'd heard it before, from voices that turned cruel behind locked doors. Why me? He demanded, voice sharp despite the quiver. The man sighed, rubbing his face. I used to run a shelter. Seen too many kids like you disappear. Ellis's chest tightened. Truth? Or bait? Ghost's growl softened, but his stance stayed rigid. The man pointed down the street. Old bookstore, 2 blocks. I'll be there if you decide. Then he turned, vanishing into the snow, his footprints fading fast. Ellis stood, clutching the bar, Ghost pressing against his leg. The cold bit deeper, past his skin, into his soul. He wasn't shivering anymore, bad sign. He knew what that meant. Death was close, whispering in the wind. He could stay, let it take him, or follow, risk it. He looked at Ghost, whose amber eyes gleamed with something fierce. Trust, maybe. Ellis took a step, then another toward the bookstore, toward the unknown. But then Ghost stopped, ears perked, body tense. Ellis froze. Footsteps again, not the man's. These were heavier, faster, behind them. His pulse spiked. He turned, squinting through the blizzard. Another shadow, taller, broader, moved in the distance, deliberate, tracking them. Ghost growled, hackles up. Ellis's breath hitched. The man had left, but someone else hadn't. Who? Why now? Panic surged. Ellis stumbled forward, Ghost matching his pace. The bookstore's faint glow flickered ahead, a beacon in the storm. But the footsteps grew louder, closing in. He wasn't imagining it. This was real, flesh and blood danger. His legs burned, weak from hunger, but he pushed on. Ghost's growls turned feral, a promise of teeth if they got too close. The shadow, was it the man's trick? Partner? Or something worse? Hunting him for reasons he couldn't fathom? Ellis's mind screamed, run, hide, fight. But his body was failing. The bookstore was near, its door a shadowed promise. He reached for it, hand trembling. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Too sudden. Too wrong. Ghost spun, snarling at the dark. Ellis's heart pounded. Whatever followed them was waiting now, patient, unseen. He grabbed the handle. Locked. A choked cry escaped him. Then a noise, metal scraping inside. The door cracked open, and a hand yanked him in, Ghost lunging after. Warmth hit like a shock. The man stood there, eyes wide, glancing past Ellis into the snow. You're not alone out there, he whispered, voice tight. Ellis's blood ran cold. Someone or something had been seconds away, and it wasn't done with him yet. The bookstore's warmth enveloped Ellis like a lie, heavy and disorienting after the biting cold. Dust hung in the air, thick with the scent of old paper and mildew. Shelves loomed, crooked and sagging, their shadows stretching across the floor in the dim glow of a single bulb swinging faintly overhead. The man bolted the door behind them, his movements quick but quiet, his breath uneven. Ghost paced, ears twitching, a low whine escaping his throat. Ellis stood frozen, the protein bar still clutched in his trembling hand, its wrapper crinkling as his grip tightened. The silence pressed in, broken only by the wind rattling the windows. Sharp, insistent, like fingernails tapping glass. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Who's out there? He croaked, voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer right away. He peered through a crack in the boarded-up window, his face taut, lined with something Ellis couldn't read, fear, maybe, or guilt. Don't know, he muttered finally, stepping back. Thought it was just me watching you. His eyes flicked to Ellis, then away. Guess I was wrong. Ellis's stomach sank, a slow, cold dread creeping up his spine. Watching him? How long? The man gestured toward a battered couch in the corner. Sit. Rest. You're safe here. Safe. That word again, hollow and sharp-edged. Ellis didn't move. Ghost growled softly, circling the room, sniffing at the baseboards. Something felt off, too still, too quiet. The bulb flickered, a brief stutter of light, and Ellis's breath caught. Had the shadows shifted? Just a trick of his tired eyes, he told himself. Had to be. He sank onto the couch, the springs creaking under his weight. The warmth seeped into his bones, thawing the ache in his legs. His eyelids drooped, exhaustion pulling at him like a tide. The man rummaged behind a counter, producing a thermos and a cracked mug. Tea, he said, pouring it out. Steam curled up, faint and ghostly. Ellis hesitated, then took it, the heat stinging his numb fingers. He sipped, bitter, weak, but warm. His shoulders loosened. Ghost settled near his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. For a moment, the tension unraveled. The wind softened outside, a distant murmur. Maybe this was real. Maybe he'd made it. He leaned back, the couch swallowing him, and let his guard slip, just a little. Then a thud, low, muffled, from somewhere deep in the bookstore. Ellis's eyes snapped open, tea sloshing over the mug's rim. Ghost leapt up, ears pinned, a growl rumbling. The man froze, mug in hand, his face paling. What was that? Ellis whispered, heart thudding. The man shook his head, slow, too slow. Old building, settling. His voice was tight, unconvincing. Another sound, scrape, drag, like something heavy shifting across wood. Not the wind, not the storm. Inside, Ellis stood, legs shaky, the mug clattering to the floor. Ghost stalked toward the back, hackles raised, his growl a deep, vibrating threat. The man grabbed his arm. Stay here, he hissed, but his grip trembled. Ellis yanked free, dread clawing his chest. Settling? No. Something was alive in here with them. He crept after Ghost, the man trailing behind, muttering curses. The bulb flickered again, casting jagged shadows that seemed to twist, stretch, move. Ellis's pulse roared. The air grew colder, sharper, despite the walls around them. A narrow hallway stretched into the dark, its end swallowed by shadow. Ghost stopped at a door, old, warped, its paint peeling like dead skin. The scraping came again, louder, from behind it. Ellis's breath hitched. You said it was safe, he snapped, turning on the man. The man's jaw tightened, eyes darting to the door. It was past tense. Ellis's skin prickled. Ghost pawed at the wood, whining, then barking, sharp, frantic. The sound echoed, unanswered. Then silence. Too sudden, too heavy. Ellis reached for the knob, hand shaking. The man lunged. Don't! Too late. Ellis twisted it, the door creaking open. Dust swirled, the air stale and thick. A storage room, cluttered with boxes, shelves, cobwebs. Empty. Relief flooded him, shaky and brief. See? Nothing, he muttered, turning back. But Ghost didn't move. His growl turned feral, eyes locked on something Ellis couldn't see. The man's face drained white, staring past him. Ellis spun. The boxes, stacked unevenly, shifted, just a hair. Then again, something rustled, faint, like cloth dragging. His heart stopped. Not empty, not safe. The bulb overhead buzzed, dimmed. A shadow peeled from the wall. Tall, thin, wrong, moving when it shouldn't. Ellis stumbled back, Ghost snarling beside him. The man grabbed a crowbar from the counter, voice breaking. I didn't know. Didn't know what? The rustling grew louder, closer, deliberate. Whatever it wasn't waiting anymore. It was coming, and they were trapped. The shadow stretched, unnatural and fluid, peeling from the wall like ink spilling into the dim light. Ellis's breath seized, a scream trapped in his throat. Ghost lunged, teeth bared, a blur of fur and fury, slamming into the shape. A guttural snarl ripped through the air, followed by a sound, low, wet, not human. The man swung the crowbar, wild and desperate, smashing it into the nearest box. Cardboard split, spilling yellowed books, but the shadow didn't flinch. It moved, fast, too fast, sliding across the floor, a smear of darkness with no form. Ellis stumbled back, his heel catching on a crate, crashing him to the ground. Pain flared in his elbow, sharp and hot. Ghost yelped, skidding back, blood matting his fur. The man shouted, "Get out!" But his voice cracked, drowned by the rustling. Louder now, a chorus of whispers from nowhere and everywhere. Ellis scrambled up, heart hammering, eyes darting. The bulb buzzed, flickered, died, plunging them into black. His hands clawed the air, blind, panic choking him. Something brushed his leg, cold, slick, alive. He kicked, hit nothing. Ghost's growl turned frantic, claws scraping wood as he charged again. A thud, flesh on flesh, then a whine. Ellis's stomach dropped. "Ghost!" he yelled, voice raw. The man grabbed his arm, yanking him toward the hallway. "Move now!" Light flared, faint yellow, from the main room's bulb flickering back. The shadow loomed taller, edges sharpening into limbs, too many, bending wrong. It wasn't a trick. Not his mind. Real. Alive. Hungry. They bolted, Ellis's legs burning, the man dragging him. Ghost limped behind, snarling, blood dripping. The rustling chased them, a wave of sound. Cloth tearing, paper shredding, something heavy dragging. Shelves rattled, books tumbling like dominoes. Ellis's chest heaved, breath ragged. The door, freedom, was feet away. The man shoved him forward. "Go!" Ellis grabbed the bolt, hands slick with sweat, fumbling. Stuck. The shadow surged, a wall of black swallowing the hallway. Ghost spun, barking, a last stand. Ellis slammed his shoulder into the door. Once, twice. It gave, bursting open. Snow blasted in, icy and sharp. He stumbled out, Ghost leaping after, the man behind. The cold hit like a fist, but Ellis ran, blind, frantic, into the storm. Footsteps pounded behind him, then stopped. He turned. The man stood at the threshold, crowbar raised, staring into the dark. The shadow filled the doorway, towering, its edges pulsing. "I didn't mean to," the man choked, voice breaking. "It wasn't supposed to." A tendril lashed out, fast as a whip, wrapping his arm. He screamed, yanked back, the door slamming shut. Silence. Ellis froze, snow piling around his ankles. Ghost whined, nudging him, blood staining the white. The bookstore stood still, windows dark, no sound but the wind. The man was gone, swallowed. Ellis's knees buckled, dropping him into the snow. His mind reeled. What was it? Not human, not animal. Something older tied to the place. The man's words, shelter, kids disappearing, clicked, jagged pieces of a truth too big. He'd known. Hid it. Lured Ellis in, maybe not on purpose, but it didn't matter. Ghost pressed against him, trembling, alive. Ellis's hands shook, clutching the dog's fur. He'd escaped. Barely, but at what cost? The snow fell harder, erasing the alley, the bookstore, the nightmare. He wanted to run, but his body screamed, weak, drained. Ghost's warmth anchored him. They were alive. That was enough. For now. The storm raged on, muffling the world in white. Ellis sat, breath slowing, the adrenaline fading into a dull ache. His eyes fixed on the bookstore, its silhouette fading into the blizzard. No movement, no sound. Whatever took the man wasn't coming out. Not yet. He thought of the shadow's limbs, its hunger. Was it bound there, waiting for more? His stomach twisted, a sick realization settling in. He'd given his blanket to Ghost, a reckless choice that led him here, into warmth, then terror. Fate changed, sure, but into what? Ghost licked his hand, a soft whine breaking the silence. Ellis exhaled, shaky. They'd made it out. The man hadn't. That was the line between them, luck or something else. He pushed to his feet, Ghost rising with him. The cold gnawed, but he ignored it, stepping away from the bookstore. Each crunch of snow felt like a countdown. How long till it noticed they'd slipped free? He didn't look back. Couldn't. The street stretched empty, a blank slate of white. Ghost limped beside him, loyal, unbroken. Ellis's chest tightened, a mix of relief and dread. He'd survived the night, the shadow, the man's trap, but the cost lingered, heavy and unseen. The final moment hit him as he walked. The door slamming, the man's scream cut short, swallowed by darkness. That sound would haunt him forever, a reminder. This wasn't over. Not really. Whatever waited in that bookstore wasn't done. And deep down, Ellis knew it'd find him again. Someday. Ellis trudged through the snow, each step heavier than the last, the storm a relentless shroud around him. Ghost limped at his side, blood crusting his fur, but his amber eyes still burned with that quiet fire. The bookstore faded into the white behind them, its dark shape swallowed by the blizzard. Like it had never been there, like it could vanish and take its secrets with it. Ellis's breath puffed out in weak clouds, his body aching from cold and fear. He'd learned something tonight, something he couldn't unlearn. Kindness wasn't just a risk, it could kill. Giving Ghost that blanket had saved them, tethered them through the freezing dark, but it had also dragged him into a nightmare he barely escaped. Trust was a blade, sharp on both edges. The man's face, pale, pleading, flashed in his mind, swallowed by that shadow. Ellis shivered, and not just from the wind. The horror lingered, a weight he couldn't shake. It wasn't gone, it was waiting. He felt it in his bones, a certainty as cold as the snow under his feet. That thing in the bookstore wasn't random. The man's words, shelter, kids disappearing, echoed, jagged and incomplete. Had he fed it before? Lured others, knowingly or not? Ellis's stomach churned. He'd been seconds from that fate, pulled in by a protein bar, a promise of warmth. Survival wasn't luck. It was Ghost, teeth and instinct, and a door that gave at the right moment. But the shadow's reach, its hunger, stayed with him, a stain on his mind. He glanced at the empty street, half expecting those unnatural limbs to slither from the dark. They didn't. Not yet. He stopped, Ghost pausing beside him, ears twitching. The world was silent, too silent, the storm muffling even his own heartbeat. Ellis learned he wasn't invisible. Not to the streets, not to whatever hunted them. He'd thought the cold was his enemy, but it was just the bait. Something worse lived out here, patient, watching. He'd survived, but the cost was clarity. Safety was a lie, and every choice could pull him back into that dark. Ghost nudged his hand, warm against his frozen skin. They were alive together, that mattered. But the thought gnawed. What was that thing? Why him? The man's scream replayed, cut off, unfinished. No answers, just questions sinking into the snow with his footprints. Ellis looked ahead, the street endless, white, unknown. The horror wasn't over, it slept, biding time. He'd escaped, but it knew him now. His chest tightened, a mix of dread and resolve. He'd keep moving, keep fighting, Ghost at his side. But as the wind whispered through the empty night, one mystery lingered, sharp and unanswered. When would it come for him again? And would he see it coming next time? Ellis and Ghost disappeared into the snowy night. But the story's not over, and you're part of it now. What do you think was in that bookstore? A monster? A ghost? Something worse? Tied to the man's past? Drop your theories in the comments. I want to hear what you'd call that shadow, what you think it wanted with Ellis. Would you have followed the man inside, trusting that promise of warmth? Or run the second you heard those footsteps in the snow? Tell me, would you have given Ghost your blanket, or kept it and faced the cold alone? Your choice could have changed everything. Hit that like button if Ellis's escape had your heart racing, and subscribe if you're hooked on these mysteries. Because there's more coming, darker and twistier than this. This isn't just a story, it's a question. What's out there, waiting in the places we think are safe? The man knew something, and that shadow wasn't random. What's your guess? Did it follow Ellis? Or is it still lurking in that bookstore, hungry for the next lost soul? Share this with your friends who love a good scare. See if they'd survive a night like that. Stick around, because next time we're diving deeper into the unknown, and I need you here for it. Comment now, what's the one thing you'd never give up, even if it meant facing something like that? Let's keep this going. Your answers might just shape the next tale.